Hi, we are the Star Group. I'm Mary. We have Kendall, Juan, and Kingston. This is the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey case study. The Chapter 8 concepts that we will go over today is auto communication, post-positive approach, internalization, organizational identity, looking glass shelf, and adaptive instability. Overall, this case study focused on how the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey viewed its organizational identity and how that affected its communication decisions. The organization originally saw itself as a transportation agency focused on efficiency, control, and solving technical problems. Because of that mindset, leadership approached homelessness mainly as a policing and enforcement issue instead of recognizing it as a social and human centered issue. As negative media coverage and public criticism increased, a disconnect developed between how the Port Authority viewed itself and how the public viewed the organization. The public began to see the organization as harsh and lacking compassion. Eventually, the Port Authority recognized this gap in perception and adapted its communication and leadership approach. The organization shifted from an evictor mindset toward a more supportive and advocacy focused role. This case demonstrates how organizations can evolve when the knowledge public feedback adapt their identity and become more open to external communication.
Okay, addressing the situation, we look at who this is facing on, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. They have created their own internalization, with the quote referring to internalization refers to the incorporation of values, attitudes, and so forth within the self as guiding principles. And so they reflected themselves as a technical expert professional organization, creating these values of superior providers, quality transportations, commitment, betterment to the regions. And so they went into these attitudes of being a fixer and a can-do and a family. And this identity was externally challenged in 1982 as the homelessness increased around their stations. So the external improvements of the real estate being bought up caused the negative effect on their identity. They had a post-positive approach referring to regarding identity as one of the sets attributes that an organization has that therefore can be managed to optimize their performance. Being these fixers and having that can-do attitude, they felt that they could fix the homelessness issue themselves and adding on with the anti-loitering laws. Though over a few years, the homelessness just continued to increase around their stations, and with the entire organization affecting the multiple airports and the World Trade Center. But then in 1987, multiple effects came into place, which created a turning point for them, creating negative stories in the press, by public concerns about how they were inhumanely evicting the homelessness. And so it affected that organizational identity. So they took a early development concept of Dutton and Duckrich approach of investigated how organizational identities adapt in response to an organization's environment and concerns for how it's perceived. They heard the public's negative concerns and the stories that they adapted in response by forming a centralized homelessness project team and then funding a research project. By doing this, they also providing a model leadership to continue with that identity and internalization that they created among themselves.
I am now going to analyze where we see more of these Chapter 8 concepts in the Port Authority case and explain specifically what the organization did wrong and eventually what they did right. To begin, we have to look at the Port Authority's organizational identity. According to Albert Wedden, identity is the essential, enduring, and distinctive character of a group. For decades, the Port Authority identified itself as a high-minded elite group of fixers and technical experts. The problem was that they applied a biological metaphor to that identity. As Wrench mentions on page 271, a biological organism must maintain a strict boundary between itself and its environment to survive. Because of this fixed mindset, the Port Authority saw the homeless population as an external threat to be evicted from the facility rather than a human crisis requiring a community solution. Essentially, they treated these human beings like malfunctions in a machine, something to be repaired or removed rather than understood and helped.
Do you hear me clicking? And it is not going. Great.
The defensive nature that led them into a failed phase of auto communication. Wrench defines this concept as a situation where an organization is inherently talking to itself. Throughout the beginning years of the crisis, the Port Authority stayed in an internal loop. They were so self referential that every decision they made was designed to confirm their own identity as superiors and fixers. They completely ignored the external changes in the Manhattan real estate market and the growing public outrage because of those aspects didn't fit into their internal narrative. Instead of managing the actual issue, their strategies were directed primarily toward the organizational self. They were more concerned with being right in accordance to their own rules rather than being effective in the real world, which is why their early attempts to solve this issue with the police force failed so miserably and were negatively looked upon. However, what the organizational eventually did right was engaging in the looking glass self. As Wrench and his colleagues explain, this is a mental image based on how we believe others perceive us. By 1988, the Port Authority finally moved past its own ego and looked into the mirror of public opinion. They realized that while their internal identity was ethical, their organizational image, which is the external view of an organization, was seen as inhumane and cold by the press and local community. This was a wake-up call. They realized to keep their standing and reputation in the community, they had to change how they functioned internally and repair that damaged external image.
My computer is deciding to freeze on me now. I can't. Oh my God.
The crisis forced the organization into a state of adaptive instability. This theory suggests that an organization's identity shouldn't be a fixed label, but a rudder that can be steered to create a desirable image or outcome. The Port Authority changed its internal routines, moving away from the police-led eviction toward social advocacy. They didn't lose their fixer identity entirely, they just pointed it in a more productive direction, using their resources to build shelters and drop-down centers. In the end, the Port Authority succeeded because the members engaged in identity work, a concept from Alvison and Wilmot, to reconstruct an organizational self that community would actually accept. As management changed the way they talked about operations, employees actually began to feel heroic about providing that social leadership rather than just being transit cops. They moved from being in a closed system that was only talking to itself to an open system that provided quality leadership for the entire community. The transition from evictors to quiet advocates is a perfect example of how an organization must align its internal identity with the external environment to survive. Now I'll hand over to Juan to discuss our specific recommendations.
Our first recommendation is for the Port Authority to make organizational identity stronger and more clear. According to Albert and Wedden, organizations need a central, distinctive, and enduring identity. Employees and stakeholders should clearly understand what the organization stands for, what make it unique, and what values guide decision making. Leadership should communicate this idea regularly across all departments to reduce confusion and create a stronger sense of unity within the organization. Our second recommendation is to improve communication and openness through all the organization. Employees are more engaged when they feel informed and included. Leadership should encourage both outward communication, where employees can share concerns and ideas, and horizontal communication within departments. Creating opportunities for collaboration and feedback can help employees feel valued and connected to the organization's goals. This is also help build trust and improve organization culture. Our final recommendation is for the Port Authority to better align in internal culture with external image. Hatch and Schott explain that organizational identity is shaped by both internal culture and outside perception. If leadership promotes one image publicly, but employees experience something different internally, it can damage trust and credibility. The organization should also continue improving cultural intelligence and diversity training, so employees can work well in a diverse environment and communicate across different perspectives and backgrounds.
For our outside source, we found an article discussing organizational silos and communication. According to Bento and colleagues, communication silos prevent organizations from effectively sharing information and responding collaboratively to problems. In other words, when organizations become too internally focused, they often struggle to recognize outside concerns and adapt effectively. This directly connects to the Port Authority case because the organization became trapped in what the chapter describes as auto communication or internal thinking. Leaders focused heavily on protecting the organization's identity as technical experts instead of listening to public concerns about homelessness and community impact. Because communication with the public was limited, meaningful change was delayed for several years. This source supports the idea that organizations need open communication, collaboration, and outside feedback in order to successfully adapt to social changes and maintain public trust. Our questions for you are: why is it dangerous for organizations to rely too heavily on their own internal perspectives? How can public perception influence an organization's identity and communication strategies? Do you think that organizations should adapt their identity based on public opinion, and why or why not? Thank you so much for watching. Have a good day.